Greetings folks, Archbishop Ron here again with just a few more thoughts about our upcoming vote on marriage equality. Firstly, I'd like to thank everyone that gave such positive feedback after my last video. I do appreciate it. I also had some negative feedback. That's to be expected. And most of these people said that I had no understanding of what marriage was according to the biblical tradition. Let me tell you, you are wrong. I do have an understanding, and I'd like to share a number of examples of marriage according to the biblical tradition. Let's start now with Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 3. This is a verse that has been used by many nations and many states, particularly in the United States of America, up until the mid-20th century at least, to justify the banning of interracial marriage. It was used basically to stop marriage between blacks and whites, particularly in the South of America. I'll share that verse with you now. Do not intermarry with those of other tribes. Do not give your daughters to their sons. Do not take their daughters for your sons. It's a fairly straightforward and I think fairly simple admonition. But wise King Solomon himself fell foul of that. We read in 1 Kings chapter 11 that Solomon married many women from outside his tribe and women from outside of his nation. We read there also that Solomon had 300 concubines, which biblical scholars now advise us and we understand to be lesser wives. We know also from the Bible that 4 of Jacob's 12 sons were born of the slaves of his 2 or 4 wives. We know also that Abraham's first son was born of the slave of his wife. So basically the Bible is giving us permission to have sex outside of marriage, and it also legitimizes the children of the relationships that we have outside of the marriage. I wonder how that fits with the traditional view of marriage. But the Bible goes further because it legitimized marriage that occurred as a result of rape. Again, in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 22, we read this. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not betrothed to another man, and he rapes her, he shall pay the father 50 shekels of silver, and he shall marry the girl because he has violated her. I think we can all agree that he has certainly violated her. But I wonder, does it really get the man off the hook just because he decides to give daddy 50 shekels and agree to marry the girl? How does that sit with the traditional view of marriage, as claimed by some people? We find also in the Bible justification for slave marriage. And in particular, we read Exodus chapter 21, which tells us this, that if you have a male Jewish slave, you may free him. But if that slave has a wife and has children, you get to keep them. The master keeps the wife and keeps the children. This hardly speaks well to the concept that marriage is entered into for a lifetime. How is this a traditional marriage? It is Levitical tradition also that if a man is married but dies before producing an heir, the brother is obliged to marry the widow and provide an heir for the deceased brother. It goes further though, because in Genesis we read that if the brother refuses to do this, he shall be put to death. A fairly harsh punishment, no matter how you read it. We know also that in the Bible, polygamy was wide and well practiced. We know, for instance, that wise King Solomon had 700 wives, from both inside his tribe, outside his tribe, and also from outside his nation. I wonder how wise anyone is, though, to have 700 spouses. I'll leave that one up to you. God also encouraged polygamy, as I say. We read in the second book of Samuel, God said to David, I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if all of this had been too little, I would have given you more. Clearly, God says yes to polygamy. From the Christian tradition, on the other hand, we read St. Paul, who was basically anti-marriage. He said in his first letter to the Corinthians, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." He says also in that same letter, "To the unmarried and to the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I am unmarried. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry." Basically, Paul is anti-marriage. He puts celibacy above marriage. I wonder how this sits though with the concept that marriage is all about the procreation of children. You can't procreate if you're not having sex. Now there's a great deal more I can say about marriage according to the biblical tradition, but I'll leave that perhaps to another time. What we have heard today are examples of marriage as it was lived at various stages in biblical times, at various stages in history. What we are voting on now is how marriage can or should be lived in contemporary Australian society. When we vote yes to marriage equality, we will not be voting to allow people to marry more than one person at a time. Polygamy will still be outlawed. We will not be voting to allow us to marry our half-siblings. That will still be outlawed. We are not voting to allow us to rape and to marry the victim. That will still be outlawed. We are not voting to allow us to have slaves and to marry them. That will still be outlawed. What we are voting on is the ability of two loving, consensual, non-related adults to enter into a lifelong covenant of love, a covenant that can be enjoyed by every other Australian at this point. I encourage you to vote yes to marriage equality, but I also encourage you to put the vote in the envelope and get it to the post as soon as you can. Don't let it sit with the other mail. Thank you for your time. Have a wonderful day and God bless.